Dear friends from the Antwerp Port community, good morning. Glad you are with us on the third day of our Community Week for an extremely interesting session called The Great Reset. The Great Reset was the name of the 50th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, which was held in June 2020. And the title reflects the theme of rebuilding the society and the economy in a more sustainable way, following the COVID pandemic. Today, we hope to inspire you with an exchange of thoughts from the Great Reset on topics like resilience, sustainability, innovation, and much more. How are we going to do that? Well, we found two great speakers for that. And let me start from and in Geneva, Adrian Monk. Welcome, Adrian, Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, an award-winning journalist, currently member of the World Economic Forum's Managing Board, leading the public engagement and foundations. Previously, he headed the Department of Journalism at the City University of London, where he was also a professor. And as a journalist, he spent his career with CBS News, ITN, and Sky News. He is also a published author. Managing Director of the WEF, journalist, professor. Needless to say, we have an extremely interesting personality amongst us. Thank you for joining us today, Adrian, on this Community Week and for your willingness to share your thoughts. A warm welcome.
Thanks,
Before
Luc.
giving the floor to you, Adrian, I want to give the word to Jacques van der Merwe, CEO of the Port of Antwerp. Dear Jacques, good morning. Also a warm welcome to you.
Good morning, Luc.
It was again a very busy week, so we are glad you could make it this morning for this discussion. And before starting the actual subject of the session, the question to you, why Port of Antwerp is involved as an active partner in the World Economic Forum?
Well, first of all, it's a very long love story between WEF and the Port of Antwerp, because we are committed as an active partner with WEF for more than 25 years. And we think that it creates a lot of added value, unique added value for the port, but also for the port community, because it allows us to sit around digital or real tables with great thinkers like Adrian and Borge Bende and Dr. Schwab himself, but also high experts in different fields and performing international organizations and companies. So more than ever, it's important when all of us are facing growing challenges in a fast-changing world. And well, we are faced with long-term disruptions these days, and it requires long-term strategy, development, and finding solutions. And then, collaboration and partnerships are more than ever key and crucial. And in our role as a community builder, we do this every day. We create unique partnerships, coalitions of the willings, whether it comes to imminent fighting or climate actions, disruptive business operations and how to make them sustainable, innovation on technological developments. Well, nobody can find a solution by himself. So it is really, when it comes to the transition, finding collective actions, collaborations, partnerships that will pave the way. That's the only path to follow, in my opinion. And then when you have the opportunity to sit with those creative thinkers, collective action on a global scale, that's for a world port like the Port of Antwerp, we want to have global impact. And then you need that international perspective. And then you have to sit with the world champions to find and to start that collective action. And that's why for more than 25 years we sit together with the experts of the WEF in Davos and in other regions of the world. And very happy to have done this, and we will for sure continue to do this.
Exciting. I guess it's not by accident that during the 2020 difficult year, we even strengthened the partnership with the WWF.
Absolutely, because COVID-19 will most probably reinforce and accelerate lots of trends that we will discuss in the coming hour.
That's now we can fluidly go to the continuation of this session. Thank you, Jacques. Adrian, before we start the interactive part, we'd love to hear your introductory thoughts and keynote remarks. Please.
Thanks very much, Jacques and Luc. I'm just admiring your fantastic-looking studio there in Antwerp. Just behind me, I don't know if you can see the waves and the sails. It's a little painting of Antwerp from 500 years ago, and it's a really interesting reminder, I think, that Antwerp has been a global hub for half a millennium, if not more. And I think, you know, it's a tribute to how the port has stayed with the contemporary kind of global environment, that you and the leadership are doing what you're doing to make sure that Antwerp stays right at the very top of the world's ports. I wanted to just start, if I may, by explaining a little bit about the Great Reset, which you mentioned at the beginning. And what is it exactly? You can find out probably if you dive around on YouTube, various strange thoughts about what it all means. But essentially, when COVID hit, the world's governments took on the challenge of trying to support an economy, a global economy that was going into shock. And how did they do that? They did that in the only way governments really know how. They put money into the economy. And they did it with something like $20 trillion of extra cash liquidity put into the global economy. Now, for anyone who remembers the 2008 global financial crisis, you'll probably recall that a lot of liquidity was pumped into the global economy then. Nothing like the scale that we've seen now. And also, very hard to remember what happened to that money back in 2008. I'm sure people that people that are involved in the Port of Antwerp community would probably struggle to say what exactly happened to all that cash that was delivered into the financial system to save us from financial collapse in 2008. And you're right, it's very hard. You can't see new port buildings, you can't see new ships, you can't see new buildings. It disappeared effectively. Now, this time round, when we saw the amount of effort that was being put into the global economy, the Forum's first thought was, how do we actually turn this into something that is not what it's immediately intended for, which is, you know, it's a massive elastoplast or bandage on the global economy. How can we do something that actually leaves us better off than where we came from? So how can we get this 20 trillion investment into the global economy directed into areas that will result in some kind of improvement? Now, that decision is taken by governments, and typically they don't, as anyone knows, wander around looking for places to hand out money to. You know, anyone who remembers 2008 will know that central bankers were not sitting in cars, roaming the streets, handing out cash to people, nor, you know, did helicopter money drop from the air. This money goes into the financial system and gets gobbled up by the financial sector. Does it have to be like that? Well, you know at the Port of Antwerp, and your colleagues and your network know that actually there are a lot of productive ways that that money can be used to improve the world in which we live. And so really what we wanted people to focus on was, what are those productive ways? What are the ways that we can see that people can actually come out of this in a better way? And there's two real things that we wanted to push people towards thinking about. One was climate change, because we know that the challenge that's looming on the horizon is the climate. You know, you can see it probably in the falling water levels on the Rhine summer after summer. Antwerp is right in the heart of the Low Countries, which have been battling with the oceans for centuries. You know that climate change is coming as a threat to your business, to global trade. How can we use some of that 20 trillion to actually ensure that the measures we're going to need to take are actually taken? The second piece is about retraining. One of the things that this crisis has done is it's accelerated investment in automation. We've seen people looking at ways they can cut out the human factor, us, from the production process. I remember personally that, my grandfather was a cinema projectionist in the 1930s, when being a cinema projectionist was an incredibly skilled job. 50 years of his career went by, and at the end of his career, all you had to do was turn a button and switch it off. There was no skill involved in the job that he'd given half a century of his life to. Now, do we want a society where people are not given chances to gain new skills, to upskill, and to equip themselves for the jobs that are coming? I think we do. And I know that employers like the Port of Antwerp Authority are absolutely interested in making sure that the people who are at the heart of these businesses get the kind of reskilling and training we need, which is why at the Forum we have this 1 billion reskilling challenge, where we want to reskill 1 billion people around the world. So essentially the Great Reset's about two things. It's about making sure that the money that's going into keeping our economies going, keeping the lights on, is also directed into ways that leave us better off than when we started. Secondly, it's about making sure that the people who are at the heart, frankly, of this economy, what is the economy without the human element, that those people are given the opportunities to move with the processes that are underway, which is to say automation. So that's, if you like, in brief, a kind of high-level view of what the Great Reset is in terms of the motivation, in terms of our vision for it. We, as you know, are a convener. We don't have authority or power or mandate to do things with our ideas, but what we try to do is to share those ideas with people, to inspire organizations, governments, employers to actually think about some of those things, to lift their eyes up from the 3-month horizon and actually look at the 5-year, 10-year horizon and see how they can make sure that what they're doing now doesn't feel wrong when you're looking at that longer time frame. So I'll stop there for a moment, because that's a kind of, that's a view of where the Great Reset is, and hand back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Adrian. Lovely to have that historic perspective as well, going to the past, looking forward. Great. And we are also flattered with the wonderful background you put there. I think the whole port community is happy that Geneva is now a little bit Antwerp. Thanks for that as well. We will have a discussion on macro trends, and for that purpose we have prepared questions around 3 themes. So we clustered them around 3 themes, and these 3 themes are consumers of the future, energy of the future, and supply chain of the future. We will each time ask you, Adrian, to reply to some of the questions, and then I will ask Jacques to reflect on the comments that you have given and to give a viewpoint from a port, a big port in this case. After the 3 sessions, there is Q&A, and I already ask now the audience to put your questions, drop your questions in the Q&A box. We are all overwhelmed by webinars, so I don't have to explain how that works technically, right side of the screen, and so on. Please drop your questions. It will be an interesting part after the 3 sessions to listen and to get replies to your questions. But Adrian, before starting, a bold question. I read in the document Great Reset that pandemics are something that has been part of mankind through the full history. We had, in the Roman times, there were the plagues, Justinianus, there was in the Middle Ages, of course, the Black Death, we had the Spanish flu in the more modern times. So some people might say, why do we need the Great Reset? Let's just get over the crisis and go on business as usual. Why a Great Reset? Even the mortality rate, and I know it sounds very bizarre, but even the mortality rate is extremely low compared to these historic pandemics.
It's a really, really good question. And I think it speaks in a way to the changing expectations that all of us have. I mentioned, you look back 100 years ago, for example, at the pandemic of 1918, which killed so many young people around the world. Incredible death toll, especially amongst the 20-somethings at that time coming out of World War I. If you look at the change in our own expectations, and one of the ironies of the pandemic is that all of us, want the best possible treatment individually. I don't think, if you go back 100 years, people died in their homes. People were not taken to hospital. People were lucky if they got beds. They were lucky if they had access to medical facilities. That's not the case now. We now have very sophisticated machinery. We have very advanced places where people are taken for treatment. And we expect that treatment to carry on right until the last moments of life. And we've seen the burden that places on our healthcare systems in advanced economies, because that burden is placed by the ICUs, the intensive care units. And what we know is that when their capacity is reached, all kinds of bad things happen. That's to say, not just people who are suffering with the pandemic, but people who need cancer treatment, people who have accidents that need treatment. These kinds of people are pushed out of the healthcare system. And so our expectations have risen, and they've risen rightly. None of us wants to go back 100 years to a place where we're quietly told to go and pass away in the privacy of our own homes. We want the best treatment. And balancing those things out is not easy. And I think one of the aspects of looking at the need for a great reset, if you like, is how do we emerge from this crisis in better shape? And I think that's the fundamental question that people have to ask themselves. Emerging from this crisis in better shape is not going to be saying that we'll accept more of our fellow citizens and more of our family members will have to die in order for us to get back to economic normality. That's not something I think anyone wants to see happen. So instead, when we look at the effort that we're making, how do we put those investments in? And as I say, we're nearly past $20 trillion of global investment. How do we make sure that money doesn't just sink into financial institutions, doesn't just sink into vaults, that it actually gets deployed in helping us come out of this crisis better equipped than when we went in to face some of the challenges? So, Luke, I hope that's at least some of an answer.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. No further discussion on the need for the Great Reset. Let us start with the first subject, consumer of the future. Adrian, start with you. Consumer of the future. What will be the profile of the consumer of the future? And you might also want to relate to the topic of immigration, which is one of the key elements also in the Great Reset book. Please.
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that we've seen, and I think this pandemic has really brought it home to people, is we're moving towards an experiential economy, and we're moving towards a service-based economy. There's a couple of things driving that. On the service front, we know that we're faced with aging populations. People across Europe, people even in China are getting older. They're not having as many kids. This is having an impact on population structure, but it's also having an impact on demand. In the 1950s and 1960s, you had this incredible bulge of young people moving into the global economy. Those people wanted records, they wanted movie theaters, they wanted entertainment, they wanted clothing. Now those people are in their 60s, 70s, 80s. Those people want carers, they want cleaners, they want people to help them move around. They're looking for very different things than they were looking for all those years ago. So I think those, we kind of look at older people and say, well, are they really the consumers of the future? But they're actually the wealth of the future. And they do play a huge role in shaping what it is that people want. Now, we know in that kind of balance, we can sort of see into the future in a sense with consumers. And one of the places you can see into the future is Japan, where Japan is a very wealthy society. It's been the number 2, number 3 economy in the world for decades. And that economy is now facing a crunch in terms of population. You're seeing a beginning of a shrinkage in Japan's population. And what that does to economic growth is one of the profound things that we'll have to think about as we move forward, because there's really only two ways to tackle that if we think about future consumers, if we want more of them. One is for people to have bigger families, and we know the barriers to that are often about empowering women and providing the kind of childcare facilities that allow women to work and play a role in the workplace. Secondly, it's about looking at what we do to allow people to come into economies from other countries. How do we integrate those people? And these are not economic issues, they're political questions, because ultimately, people have to decide what they want to be the future of their society. In Japan, for example, there's been a huge movement to empower women. You haven't seen a huge movement to allow immigration into Japan. That's a decision that Japan's come to. Now, every single country, as we move forward, looking at the future of consumption, is going to be asking the same question. And for a port like Antwerp, which is dealing in physical things, which is dealing in products, this service-led economy, this kind of future where people perhaps want less stuff and more experiences, that I think is something that everyone's going to have to think about and see how ports can remain relevant with that kind of changing demographic.
Thanks, Adrian. Jacques, less stuff, more experiences. Doesn't sound good for a port. What should we do as ports?
Well, maybe it's not good for a port like we experienced port in the past, but I'm looking at the port of the future and how to embed a port in its culture, its history, nature, and everything that surrounds a port, and how to develop a port towards a sustainable port, a clean port, a healthy port, a just port, an inclusive port. That's, in my belief, the big challenge. And in my belief, the time, the window of opportunity is right now to make the shift from an old port, focusing on moving goods without any concern, into, a very important link in a global supply chain, but in a broader surrounding, where our concern is how to redefine value and taking into account the impact of a port on environment, on society, and on governance, in a way to have a better control on the risk and to develop our competitive advantage and how to seize new opportunities. You can see this as an opportunity instead of a threat, and it comes, in to serve more than your shareholders, to serve your stakeholders. And I was very happy with Adrian referring to the people being at the heart of the economy, and that's our baseline now for the Port of Antwerp, is how to reconcile a few things, namely people, planet, and prosperity, and to bring all the interests of our stakeholders together. That's the big challenge. So I see it as an opportunity, but it won't be a walk in the park, that's for sure.
But it's good to hear that the Port of Antwerp is also looking at this consumer, at the demand side, to determine its strategy. That's good to hear. It's part of our thinking.
Absolutely. The consumer is at the heart of our concern, but also the concern of the 1,000 companies that are embedded in the port today. And we see indeed that consumers are evolving. E-commerce is one trend that we noticed over the last weeks. But we have also in the so-called blue banana. Close to our port, and which is one of the big advantages of the Port of Antwerp. It's the location, having 60% of the consumers, of the power of the consumers in Europe, close to our port, but also all the main production centers of Europe are close to the Port of Antwerp. So that's why we have a balanced port when it comes to import and export, and we have to maintain this. Hopefully, we will continue to produce things, stuff, goods in Europe that are required and desired in the rest of the world. So it's indeed a big challenge.
That's lovely. Adrian, I think you will like it that ports are thinking in a different way and not only about dealing with volumes. So that's, I think, a positive message that the thinking is changing. The word e-commerce was dropped. You mentioned shrinking population, aging population. On the other side, which has a negative impact, you could say, on material demand. On the other side, we have seen, and many ports, but we have seen in Antwerp, a growth in the COVID-19 period in volumes for e-commerce. What's your view on this? How is e-commerce going to change the world in the coming years?
I think one of the things we've seen with the pandemic is a step change in a number of behaviors. And I think the step change that we've seen in relation to deliveries and commerce is that people looked at those things as nice extras, and now they've become the only real way of getting access to goods. And I think that really has profound implications for the next 10 to 15 years in terms of how people consume. I mean, just to give people an example of how quickly things change, go back to 1909 in the United States. Farms were running on mule trains. There wasn't a single internal combustion engine on an American farm. 15 years later, there were 6.5 million of them. 6.5 million. A massive, massive change in both the productive capacity of the US agricultural sector, a massive change in the number of people they needed to actually run farms, a massive change in the infrastructure that had been devoted to horses, that had been devoted to leather, that had been devoted to saddlery, all of this in 15 years. And a world war in the middle of it, to boot. I think when we look at the speed of change in something like e-commerce, you're seeing now, for example, a massive opportunity for point-to-point delivery, which is also something I know drones are something that the port is engaging with, looking at how it can play a role in helping some of that process. But we're seeing now drones that can take something like a ton of cargo. I mean, you know better than I do, a container will take about 28 tons of cargo, just one container on some of the massive, massive vessels that pass through the port. But it won't be long before those kinds of capacities are much higher. And when they become much higher, the need for us to circulate through traditional emporia, through traditional hubs might well change. And I think this is where the vision that Jacques outlined really is important, because if you rest on your laurels, if you look at the world as it is today and plan your next 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead, believing that you'll need more horses, more saddles, more leather, more hay, you are going to be in a lot of trouble. And I think it's really encouraging for me, when I had a chance to look at what you're doing with drone technology, to see that the port is really embracing this and looking at ways that it can actually play a part in this new economy and be a major player. So, I'm encouraged by looking at what Antwerp is doing in the field of e-commerce. Luke.
An open invitation for you to comment on e-commerce, drones. Ports are usually transshipping big volumes. World is changing. How are we prepared for that, and are we preparing ourselves for that?
Well, the story is indeed more than ton and TUs these days for a port. It remains important, of course, but now we are looking beyond the tons and the TUs. So, what is our role in this transition? And we have to embrace the e-commerce trend. We are followers, and again, we have a few opportunities in that field. Our location, but also our extensive storage capacity in the port. So from that central location and having that huge storage capacity with drones and other modes of transport, we can connect easily with those 60% of the European consumers. But we have to embrace all the new technology and start to innovate what we are currently doing with drones, with sensors, and we are laying a digital lay on our port. We want to have all the data in real time, so to understand what is happening and so to seize those opportunities. But it's a complete mental shift for everyone to develop those technology and to use them in your current processes, and probably to reinvent all the processes, not only the port authority, but all the port community. And that's the challenge. But looking at our community and the coalition in the port, I think we are well prepared. And it's, in my opinion, it's a story of opportunities. So of course it will be difficult, and of course we will have to forget about the horses and the saddles and so on, and we will have to move into something new that could be a threat for some, but it's inevitable. We have to do this to maintain our competitive advantage and to stay on top of the trends and be the driver of the change instead of a contributor and a remainder, a dinosaur of the past.
Well, I feel when reading about all the initiatives we are taking on the drones, for instance, that we are a front runner, what you confirmed. So Antwerp, go on in this way. That seems to be the logical conclusion. And we are going to end this first session. Don't forget that I allow to be overwhelmed by questions, so please put them in the box. But we move on to our next subject, energy of the future. Adrian, I'm reading out of the Great Reset document. It says, even the lockdown came nowhere near to be a viable decarbonization strategy because the world economy kept emitting large amount of carbon dioxide. Yeah, this makes us desperate. So what else do we have to do to actually push decarbonization if even COVID doesn't reach the goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the depressing factors about the pandemic has been that people feel they've been punished by the measures that have had to be taken for public health purposes, and they feel that the punishment should at least come with some kind of reward, perhaps above and beyond saving the lives of fellow citizens and family members, and perhaps carbon emissions are one of those rewards. And we've certainly seen air travel dramatically curtailed. You know, the skies clear of aircraft, airports running empty. But what we've come to understand is that air travel is just a fraction of the carbon emissions that the world needs to get on top of, and that there are a whole bunch of other ways that we're generating carbon. And you only have to look, for example, at emerging economies where new power stations that run on coal are being built to see that basically we have a mountain to climb when it comes to addressing climate change. But it's a mountain that we can climb. I think that's the most important element. You know, Jacques mentioned the efforts that Antwerp is taking to become a clean, sustainable port. And I think those kinds of efforts, if we see those scaled across major employers, major businesses, they support the kind of commitments that governments are making to try and affect change. And one of the encouraging things I think we've seen in the last 5 years coming out of the Paris Agreement on climate back in 2016 is that governments increasingly are saying it's not just about us passing a law and saying we're going to abolish carbon. They're actually saying we want to work with people to clean up the whole supply chain of carbon from the beginning to the end and make sure that we can start to drive it down. Because I think one thing everyone appreciates is that the weather situations that we're facing, the climate situation that we're facing, is going to make the pandemic look like a sideshow. I think that awful wake-up call is something that the world needs to heed. And I'm really pleased to see leaders like the Port of Antwerp taking that on directly and making sure that they're committing themselves to a more sustainable, renewable future in terms of how they power their operations. Luc.
The plans, the intentions of the European Green Deal, will that be sufficient to reach our climate goals?
I think it's a step in the right direction, but when we're talking about this great reset, you know, the devil is in the detail, really. How does that money end up actually affecting carbon levels? There are many, many factors that, you know, influence the final destination of both legislation and finance. And I think one of the things we believe as an organisation is that as many different groups as possible need to be involved in those conversations. Governments, yes. Businesses, yes. NGOs, yes. Civil society, academia, yes, absolutely. Because the more people we have involved in those discussions, the more we can be assured that that Green New Deal is not just greenwashing, it's not just political happy talk, it actually ends up meaning something.
Jacques, Port of Antwerp, following the European Green Deal ambitions, we also want to be a climate neutral port by 2050. What will be our major challenges to reach that climate neutrality in a relative short time?
Well, that's by far the biggest challenge of all. That being one of the main energy sinks of Europe, having the biggest petrochemical cluster of Europe, the second largest of the world, you can imagine what it means to decarbonize the feedstock. For instance, of the chemical industry, that and by half, reducing by half in 2030, because 2050 may sound as far, yeah, that's far away, but 2030, that's 9 years from here. And so the effort is massive. It's huge when it comes to the timing, when it comes to the robustness, when it comes to the volumes, when it comes to the innovation, the technology that are involved. It's being a former CEO of an energy company for more than 25 years. my experience of the past is more than ever relevant here in the Port Challenge. We will have to deal with more electrons coming from renewable energy, but also more molecules. So for sure, in the transition, renewable energy, sun and wind will be the cornerstone of the story. Unfortunately, in Belgium is a small country, and even Europe, most probably we don't have enough sun or wind to deal with this challenge. So we will have to look beyond and develop new strategies with countries where you have more sun and more wind and more space. And that's what we are currently doing. But on the short term, I think CCS, so the capture of carbon, is key to obtain the goals on 2030. Beyond 2030, then it's green hydrogen coming in, circular economy, of course, using carbon as a new material. That are the solutions. And we, again, we want to be front runners, so we are developing some of coalitions and projects to launch those initiatives. Otherwise, we will be too late. So this decade is really key in the transition, and ports will hopefully play an important role. And we will give, or we want to give the example, and we'll tell to the world, we can do this, and hopefully we will be copied by many.
Yeah. Could you explain just a little bit more to the audience what exactly the role of ports could be in this hydrogen economy? Because one might say it's all about production. You mentioned that our country is probably not the best place to make green hydrogen, yet we are very active. What is our role, and perhaps even how can the community contribute?
Yeah. Well, to begin with, we have the potential off-takers. When it comes to energy, you have, of course, the electricity dimension, but you have also the how we heat our homes and our offices, how we move goods and ourselves, so the transport, but also the feedstock of the industry. And then you have, of course, electricity, but it's a big challenge. So we need big volumes to deal with the transition. And then we will have to ship it. I'm telling more and more that we will have to ship the sunshine and wind from places where we have those and where we need it. And the transition will happen under our feet by transporting CO2 and hydrogen, being with ammonia or synthetic methane or methanol in pipelines. So, well, when you say shipping sunshine, make it liquid, then it's, well, ports and ships. And so we will have to organize our port here, but also develop probably greenfield ports in places remote places like Oman, Morocco, Egypt, and Chile, Australia. And there our knowledge as port community, port builders, comes into account, and we are also representing the off-takers here in Europe. So we have definitely a role to play. And with our recent merger with Zeebrugge, we will have now two platforms, one close to the off-takers and one close to the North Sea. So and what we miss is the pipeline between those two ports, but it's only 80 kilometers, so that's doable.
Jacques, you're the man of opportunities.
Absolutely.
Great to hear. Let's round off this session. Perhaps a short answer, Adrian. I have one question that's on my mind. Again, out of despair. Often you read that the great efforts we might be doing here in Europe in terms of decarbonization, that they are completely overcompensated in negative by huge carbon-based industrial developments in countries like India. How do we deal with this? How can you give us a comfort that it does make sense for Europe to be front runner, although we are limited in impact, even if we would increase decrease with 50% and eventually 100%?
As someone who, before this crisis, used to spend too much of his life traveling, I've had an opportunity to see the effects of pollution, not just in India, in other parts of the world. And I think what can give us hope is that all of us have to share the same environment. I think 10 years ago, if you'd looked at Beijing and looked at the pollution levels there, you would have despaired. If you'd gone back to London in the 1950s and looked at the smog that killed so many people, you would have despaired at our ability to actually move forward. And I think, one of the great things about reflecting on the past is that it does give you some hope for the future. And I think what we can see is that in China now, for example, you're seeing more efforts to tackle pollution. You're seeing a major commitment by the Chinese government to get down to carbon neutrality by later in the century. And I think in India too, India is looking to power its future, but India has to also breathe. It has to look after its people. And, that nexus of, health and well-being and progress is something that no government can ignore. At the end of the day, governments have to breathe the same air as the people who work in their economies. And that is, I think, a very powerful factor prompting people to change. I go back and recall, for example, that it wasn't in the 1950s, it was when you couldn't see inside the English Parliament that they finally acted to do something about the Clean Air Act and ban burning coal to heat people's homes. Now, those similar kinds of things affect every single person from the highest to the lowest in those economies. And I think we're going to see the change. I think China's shown leadership on this, Europe's showing leadership on this, and I think if we want to stay at the vanguard of this change, if we want to be where the future is, then embracing renewables is absolutely essential. And I think the kinds of things you're talking about in Antwerp are absolutely key to making this future work.
Lovely. Thanks for your words of optimism here. Let's move on to the third subject, supply chains of the future. Adrian, last year, during the COVID pandemic, a lot of companies were facing too high dependence on supply from China. One heard more and more the subject coming back, which we know from before, but it was actual again, and nearshoring, bringing production closer to consumption markets. Is this going to happen, or is that something we will again forget because cost remains the driving factor?
I think one of the things that we've seen in the global economy is that we're not going to disconnect ourselves from one another. The products that are being made in Asia are not going to suddenly be made in Europe, and similarly the US, Latin America. The global economy is not about to shut up shop and fall in on a kind of autarky scenario. But you're absolutely right to say that the vulnerabilities that it's exposed are real. And companies have to take precautions. They have to think about their future, and they have to think about how that vulnerability might affect them going forward. So I think it's definitely going to be something on the supply chain front that people have to grapple with. But if you actually look at the response to the pandemic, the response to the pandemic has involved collaboration across geographies. It's involved production across geographies. Our ability to respond in terms of producing vaccine, producing the glass vials necessary, getting the cold storage systems in place to actually transport them, these are all things that require a sophisticated and open global economy. So I think one of the lessons that we've seen from the pandemic is that it's as important as ever to keep those links open, perhaps make them more robust, perhaps make them more secure, and perhaps that does involve more cost. But at the end of the day, I think the pandemic's message is that we need to keep the doors open as far as possible. Luke.
Thank you. Jacques Ports live, of course, from international trade. Do you see this re- and nearshoring, if it happens more frequently, to be a threat? And how can we, in general, be involved in more sustainable supply chains?
Well, again, it's a possible threat, but maybe also an opportunity. When I discuss with CEOs of our customers here in Antwerp, for instance, the chemical industry, they are thinking about reorganizing the supply chain, not only due to the pandemic, but in general. And one of the reasons is, of course, again, the impact on climate. Nearshoring can, in theory, have a better impact. So we are discussing, and we will follow, of course, what they will decide. But our role, in my opinion, as a port, is to have that modal shift and that mental shift. So the modal shift. Avoid having stuff and goods on the road instead of barges or rail. So that's our role to increase the efforts to have that modal split in favor of rail. And there again, the Green Deal is an opportunity. The timing is now to double, for instance, our percentage on rail from 7 to 15 in the coming years. But it requires also a mental shift from all the stakeholders involved to rethink how to position themselves in the chain. Well, we try to again. Become a front runner in the Getting to Zero coalition, for instance, when it comes to decarbonize the shipping industry. It's important to have that impressive coalition supported by the World Economic Forum, to have those big vessels in 2030 that are on something else than the diesels. So then it comes on LNG, again, the green hydrogen, but also when it comes into our port, the cold ironing, having to plug a ship into the electrical grid instead of having the diesel engines turning. So again, we have to do things right now to have something else in 2030. And I'm happy to see how an impressive coalition of different players in that field are regrouping and are taking a collective action. That's where we, as a world port, have to play a role. We, like Rotterdam, of course, and Vancouver and Los Angeles. Luckily for us, we are not alone here in this story, because we will have to convince the ship owners to make some investments on their side. But on the land side, it's important to be ready whenever they take a decision. And so the focus on innovation, on new technology, is really important.
Yeah. Can digitization help us also to make supply chains more sustainable?
Absolutely, that's key. Make the whole supply chain more transparent. Will probably be shorter, less costful, and so on. So we developed in the port, together with the port community, Nextport, a digital platform, and sharing data. It's important. It will make us all more intelligent, and we will take some low-hanging fruit today, because the administrative cost in the supply chain is today important, way too important. So we can reduce this, and that again will have a positive impact on climate, but also on our position. It will, a port that is more accessible is more attractive. So we have to invest in digitization, and again, not only the port authority, but with the customs, very important player in global supply chain, and with the port community, and that's what we are currently doing.
Adrian, you feel the energy and the vibes here in Antwerp.
Absolutely, no, it's very encouraging.
On the global scale, how can that have impact? Could you have some comment on that?
Sorry, I just missed that question.
Just want to know how digitization also on a global scale will have impact, and then do we need to take special further steps as a world economy to speed up?
I mean, one of the things that the World Economic Forum's been involved in is really looking at the problems around the fourth industrial revolution, what we call the fourth industrial revolution, which is artificial intelligence, a lot of digitization, a lot of new technologies coming together to really transform the world in which we live right now. And so that digitization piece really does require standards. You know, we're at a moment before almost the shipping container was invented. We need some of the rules of the road for digitization so that people have standards that they can work to, so there are protocols that people can adopt. Because if you're going to have global cooperation, you need some global playing field which actually doesn't disadvantage key players and key geographies. So I think that's really important, and that's really vital work, and that's one of the things where, one of the areas where coalitions play a part, and where also an organization like the World Economic Forum can play a part in helping to bring together the right actors and making sure that there's some agreement on what that level playing field looks like.
Great, thank you. Adrian, Jacques, thanks for this interactive part. Let's now have a look at the questions from the audience. Oh, very busy. Let me have a look. Adrian, I'm going to pick out this one because I find it an interesting one. How will the future of fossil fuels look like? How will the major oil companies evolve within the next 5 to 10 years? Will these companies, oh, it's a daring question, will these companies disappear, especially in Europe, where there is a strong ambition to become climate neutral? Your vision, please.
Gosh, that's a small question to tackle at this time in the morning on Friday.
Short, Adrian, because we are running out of time, so please make a short answer. Sorry.
I'll make it quick. Look, I think a couple of things are happening. You're seeing companies divest themselves of dirty parts of their businesses. And I think what you'll see is the finance leading people away from areas where of fossil fuel investment and away from the kind of, the old fuels. That means potentially that a lot of that will be privatized. A lot of it will move out of the public space. What does that really mean? Does it mean that we will see companies getting cleaner, or will they just be taking dirty pieces of their industry off their balance sheets? I think that's a really fundamental question. That's something people have got to think about in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. Jacques, you want to have a comment? We have a lot of these big players in our port.
Well, they are living in a perfect storm, and we sit with them frequently on various topics, and I see that they are discussing their strategy on the longer term, and most probably it will be different from company to company. You will have some evolving toward electricity players, other ones focusing on hydrogen, but I don't know. It's the talk of the town. Of course, in a petrochemical cluster, it's important to find out what the future will be of our cluster, and they will play a massive role. But it are strong companies, so it's when you are in a perfect storm that you see the strength of a company.
Yeah. let's hope they have all the resilience required to go to a future state. One more question here. Yeah, Adrian, the port of Antwerp, there are a lot of small and medium-sized companies. So I guess that's a question coming from that angle. A lot of entrepreneurs are struggling with short-term and basically trying to survive through tomorrow. So how can we inspire them for the Great Reset?
Look, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the responsibilities that governments have is to make sure that those small and medium enterprises are looked after. And one of the things when we look at these kind of big macro problems is it's so easy to forget that small companies haven't got the resources to invest long term. They perhaps are struggling from week to week or month to month. And really, government has to play a part in taking on shouldering, if you like, some of the burden of making sure that they're looked after. Because we've seen with the Gilets jaunes protests in France, for example, what happens when people feel left behind. And so if we're going to carry people with us on this journey to a cleaner future, if we're going to carry them with us on this journey to new skills, they've got to feel that governments are really getting in behind them and helping them.
Thank you. I see we are getting close to our time frame, so perhaps one last question, and it's based on very recent news. This morning, we woke up with the news that the EU is considering to implement a vaccination passport, a rather drastic measure which could divide the Western world in haves and have-nots. How realistic is to put this label on the European population? Adrian?
Well, I got my vaccination passport yesterday because I just had my second jab, so my arm's a little bit sore this morning. I think anyone who's travelled around the world to places where there's yellow fever or malaria will be familiar with carrying the little yellow card that says you've had your vaccinations. It's part of what you have to do when you travel to parts of the world where there's endemic disease. And I think one of the future steps that we're going to have to live with is knowing about people's health, knowing if people are vaccinated. Now, when it comes to discriminating between people, that's very different. I don't think we can move to a world where there's two classes of people, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. In my household, my wife hasn't had the vaccine yet, my son hasn't had the vaccine yet. I don't want to be in a house where there's one rule for me and one rule for them. And I don't think we want to live in a world where there's one rule for people who are vaccinated and another for people who are not.
Yeah. Jack, you want to have a comment on that one?
Fully agree on those wise words.
And let's end the session with these wise words. I want to thank both of you for this extremely interesting conversation. At least I learned a lot from what I heard here. I also felt the world of opportunities in perhaps a bit of a darker background. There is optimism, there are opportunities, and we need to work. We need to work hard for the future. So that is something that at least I took here. And I would like to end with a very last question. Please, a short answer to each of you. What should the audience remember as most important takeaway from this Great Reset discussion? Adrian, perhaps you can start.
So very quickly, I'd just say, optimism is crucial. I think we can come out of this awful situation with our heads held high, with an understanding of what it takes to really grapple with big global problems that don't respect borders, that don't respect national boundaries. And I think we can see in the way the world's responded, it hasn't been easy, it hasn't been smooth, but we have got our act together as a planet. And I think that at least gives us encouragement for the future, and I think gives us hope that we can tackle really big challenges, because this is not going to be the last of them. There's only more to come, and I think the world needs resilience, hope, and a lot of optimism.
Great words from Geneva. Thank you very, very much. Jacques, your last comments?
Same words from Antwerp. Optimism, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So we were very resilient as a port, and I'm sure looking at the future challenges and probably difficult times ahead of us, we will be successful because we survived this crisis. We learned a lot. and our ideal location, our partnerships, our community, and I think our future looking and our optimism will be key in the next challenges. So I'm looking forward. I'm an optimism by nature, and that helps in this.
We know you like that. Thank you very, very much. Adrian, a big hug from Antwerp to Geneva.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Of course, also a big hug to Jacques. I'm not going to do that. He remains my boss. So thank you so much.
Social distance.
Okay, we are at the end of this session, but not at the end of the Community Week. So we hope you will join us on our next session, which is at 12:30, and which will be on something related to our subject here, Port of the Future. Thank you all for being with us this morning. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your attention, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you.